Just so y'all know, this is being live streamed on Facebook, and we'll also be recording it. It will be available if you'd like to watch it again, or if you'd like to check it out on YouTube or share with other people. So I think everyone that had signed up for the Zoom webinar is here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our January speaker event. Tonight we are going to be discussing archaeological studies in the Susitna Watershed, and we are here with Dr. Kathryn Krasinski. So first of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Margaret Stern, and I am the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Susitna River Coalition. We also have on the screen, and who will be moderating Facebook, Melissa Hoyer, who's the Executive Director of the Susitna River Coalition. And then, of course, there's Dr. Krasinski, who we are all here to see and listen to her expertise. I would also like to thank the generous donors that make events like this possible. We'd like to thank the Chase Community Council and the Talkeetna Community Council, as well as all of our individual generous donors. We're really grateful to them for making our winter event speaker series possible. But tonight we're here to see Dr. Krasinski. So Dr. Krasinski is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Adelphi University, but she has completed 20 field seasons studying sites in Alaska. Her primary research interests include hunter-gatherer subsistence, ice age extinctions, human diasporas, community anthropology, zooarchaeology, and taphonomy. And we might have to ask her for some definitions of some of those things. But she holds 3 anthropology degrees, including a Ph.D. from the University of Nevada Reno, a master's from the University of Alaska Anchorage, and a bachelor's from New York University. So thank you so much for joining us from the East Coast tonight, Katie, and I will pass the microphone and the screen over to you. And oh, one more thing, just so folks know, feel free to enter any questions in the chat. We will be monitoring that, and we will have question and answer at the end. So Katie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Margaret and Melissa, for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to share what I've been doing with a team I've been working with for the last 20 years in Alaska, and particularly in the Susitna Watershed and adjacent areas. Let's see if I can do this share screen. Oh, looks like we have to redo the screen share enabling.
All right.
Yep, I'm on it. Sorry. Okay, you should be good to go.
Amazing. It just works like that. Let's see. Are you seeing a full screen slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I wanted to share with all of you today is basically some long time work I've been doing in the Talkeetna and Trapper Creek areas, Susitna Watershed. And really, it's an opportunity to think about how what we're learning from the past and how Dene survived and thrived in the environment, and what we can learn in terms of moving forward with today. And I do that through the lens of remoteness. You know, when I talk to folks from outside or the lower 48, Talkeetna seems like a pretty remote space, but when you're in Alaska, it's not, that's probably not how we would classify remoteness. So kind of want to understand and reconstruct what life was like in the past based on how many people were around, or what that social environment was like, what the economic environment was like, sort of making a living, and how people interacted with their landscapes, particularly when they were new. So while Alaska is the last frontier and its state motto, we're going to kind of flip that and look at Alaska as the first frontier today, and kind of see how that changes throughout time in the middle Susitna area in particular. Let's see if I can advance this slide. There we go. And before I go any further, I want to thank Margaret and Melissa for inviting me to speak to you all today, to the Susitna River Coalition, the Northern Susitna Institute, who has supported presentations over the years, to the communities of Talkeetna and Trapper Creek, Saunders Crane Sanctuary, Great Land Trust, and all of the field school students over the years who've helped make this research possible. And also want to particularly recognize Jonathan Durr, Kathy and Rick Ernst, Norwood and Liz Marsh, and myself and the team, Miss Rick and Norwood, Yukon Don Tanner, Jeff Rasick, Fran Seegerboss, Brian Weigel, University of Nevada Reno, Adelphi, and also to Knik Tribal Council, Chickaloon Village Traditional Council, the Matanuska Susitna Borough, and the National Park Service, who have all provided funding and support and a whole lot of learning for me over the years. So what I'll try to do is talk for about 35 or 45 minutes is the plan, and really just focus on this area of South Central Alaska. And if you're joining from outside of the state, just to remember that Alaska is huge. It's, you know, almost 2.5 times the size of Texas. So, and the Matanuska Susitna Borough is about the size of West Virginia. So we're dealing with a massive area to try to learn about. And for me, the story really starts with a map like this. And what you have are a bunch of dots across the state, all representing some of the earliest archaeological sites we know in the area. And then you have this massive glacier that was here at the end of the last ice age, basically. And people don't live on top of glaciers. So all of these dots in this area in particular were places that people came to after those glaciers receded. So some of the questions that we really ask are, what was it like for people to move into a place that was recently deglaciated, and how long did that take? There's certainly Dene oral history that recognizes that it was possible to cross glaciers. So it's not that people didn't interact with and traverse glaciers, but they're also dynamic and tricky. And we don't know a lot of people setting up camps or villages on top of them on a regular basis. But it also sets the stage for thinking about sort of social remoteness and moving away from these areas of interior Alaska and the Brooks Range up in the north, where we're familiar with many more early age sites like 8,000 years and older. So if we take a closer look here, the area that we're talking about is bound by the Alaska Range in the north, by the Talkeetna Mountains on the east, and really centered on the Susitna River Valley and the greater watershed. But it means that you also have a lot of topographic differentiation. And we're also looking at an area, both in terms of today and in terms of the deeper past, where major population centers were down around Cook Inlet, as opposed to the middle Susitna. So, you know, we're talking about 100 miles or so distance, but on foot or on raft, that's a pretty big difference than if we're driving or flying. And so all of this really got started for me in 2004 when I was working for the Matanuska Susitna Borough and Fran Seegerboss, who had acquired a grant to support the survey and inventory of archaeological sites in coastal zones in the Mat-Su Borough. And so Fran put together a team of archaeologists, and we basically surveyed Mat-Su land or state land where we had acquired permits. And we also had invitations from local property owners to visit and check out sites that they were aware of on their properties. So when those invitations came, we took a look as well. And as many of you know, summer vegetation in the height of summer is pretty tall and thick. And that certainly makes it a lot harder to find archaeological sites, but you just have a methodological strategy that you stick to, and that works out just fine. Although if you're in the lucky position where you can schedule late spring, early autumn, that's a great time to get out and actually see features on the ground surface. So over the years, myself and this team have really been trying to do systematic survey across the middle Susitna region in particular, and documenting as many sites as we could. So what I'll do is kind of show you, I'll talk about one key site that we found and show you how that relates to other sites in the region and what I think that means on a regional basis for life in the past. So Alaska really is the first frontier in many ways. It's probably the first steps into the Americas from the old world, from Russia, from Europe and Asia. And this is something that humans have experienced many times in the past, is going into a new landscape. So our questions here are, when did that happen? Under what conditions? What was the environment like? And how did people make sense of a new landscape? And what you're seeing here on the map are these two red triangles, which are the two oldest sites that we discovered in 2004. And they remain two of the oldest sites in the borough. They're certainly the oldest sites in the Susitna Watershed. There's one that the team discovered just at the southern end of the Alaska Range in Denali National Park, kind of right where the Mat-Su borderline ends. That is a little bit older, so that puts us into the mountains as well. So these still remain the key sites that we understand early archaeology from. But you also notice it's two compared to the many sites north of the Alaska Range. So we are talking explorers, pioneers, people learning new landscapes. So we named the site Trapper Creek Overlook because it sits on an elevated landform that was produced by glaciers. It's a glacial esker. And it really is the perfect location to find some of these early sites because there's a fantastic view and you can see the Susitna drainage off in the distance here. At the time, between 12,000 and about 10,000 years ago, there were very few trees on this landscape at all. So visibility would have been pretty great on clear days. And this landform is barely visible on topo maps. There's just a little hint that there might be something there. So as we were surveying, and in the full vegetation of June, saw that there was an elevated feature, went to check it out. We conducted some subsurface test excavations to see if we could find any buried artifacts, and we did. And they turned out to be, again, great view. They turned out to be in such a great position that we brought students over the next, I think it was 6 field seasons, just at this Trapper Creek overlook site that I'll call TCO. So we brought students from all across the states. We had students from Hawaii, we had Canadian students, and they're really important for learning information about the site as they learn how to excavate. But it was also a fabulous partnership with the Mat-Su Bureau because they got to see what types of projects and engage in those projects for the Mat-Su Bureau by surveying and inventorying for archaeological sites or cultural resources. So it was a great collaboration, and they also supported the local communities while they were there. It was great for everybody. So I'll just show you a little bit about what the site looks like, and then we can talk about what's found and what I think it means. If you've dug anything in the area, you probably recognize a lot of these colors in the order that they come in. It's a very nicely stratified site. It's pretty easy to tell now that we have radiocarbon dates about the age range when you're working in a place, and I'll show you what those are in a minute. There are a series of old soils that are buried here, and that's typically where we find the artifacts because they tend to be, those are stable surfaces. It's a time when the climate was stable, but most of the sediment is actually windblown silt coming up from the rivers. You've probably seen those windy days when there's all sorts of silt in the air. You can also see lots of charcoal. And while it's pretty widely dispersed here, we systematically mapped all of the charcoal that was like a centimeter and bigger and found that they were actually discretely spatially organized. So we do think that those are ancient fire hearths or ancient fires. Yeah, so when you take a look at the profile this way, it's just this beautiful profile. So one thing that we'll point out again here is this thin yellow lens. This is volcanic ash, the haze tephra. That's going to be an important marker. And then this is a stable soil, a paleosol, as well as down here. And what you're seeing down here, this is the glacial till from the creation of the landform. We don't excavate everything because we really don't know what researchers are going to invent in the future in terms of methods and being able to address questions that we weren't able to think of, didn't predict. So we always save parts of sites, and you can see that that's what's being done here as well. But the other thing you can see is that we really try to measure everything pretty closely, because understanding where any artifact or any botanical remain comes from and how they are associated together spatially is really important for telling the story accurately and reconstructing what happened at the site. As you can see, a lot of that glacial till here. Okay, so what you're looking at, these numbers are all radiocarbon dates and calendar years, basically before present, 1950, basically. And C is for component, which we interpret as different times that people were at the site. And what you can see is that there are multiple components here. So this is a landform that people came back to on a repeated basis. And it sits pretty close to the confluence of the Susitna, the Talkeetna, and the Talkeetna rivers. That's a really strategic location because you have ancient trails that followed each of those rivers. And so it's just a massive intersection. And the other thing you can see as you go down the profile, the radiocarbon dates get older and they're all in order. That's important to make sure that there's not mixing happening. You can also tell just on how beautifully layered it is that there's not a lot of mixing going on here. And potentially at the oldest, we're talking about a little over 12,000 years as a possible first human encounter with Trapper Creek Overlook, but pretty definitively by 10,000 to 8,000, and then over and over and over again. And what we're doing here on the right side is taking samples to measure the last time that these sediments were exposed to light. It's a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. So this is a place where we are working on that technique. And for the younger materials, the calculations that the lab came up with were a really good match with the radiocarbon dates, but much older, we still have to figure out how to apply that method here. So it's also a place where we've been learning and trying new techniques. So what I have here, this line is basically the extent of that ice sheet during the last ice age. And you notice that Trapper Creek Overlook would have been under ice. That's again how it was formed. Just on the edge of that. And then there's another site that we found, Susitna River Overlook, just south of there. The tools at Susitna River Overlook, or SRO, look a little bit different. You'll see in a second, they're much bigger, but it's a harder site to get to logistically. So we've spent much less time here at SRO, so I can share a little bit about what we know there. To give you a plan view or a bird's eye view, each of these dots represents an artifact, an ecofact, mostly charcoal, or bone. So we 3-point provenience all of those, and we also screen them. And you can see how old each of these little clusters are. And that also shows you how people are continuously going back to this particular landform over and over and over again. Sometimes one on top of each other, sometimes across the landscape. So it has a pretty complicated human history. And in terms of the artifacts in that 10,000 to about 8,000-year-old range, it's mostly stone tools. We have these projectile points, and we also have microblades, which are basically, they look like razor blades made out of stone. And they're produced on these cores, the parent material. And we also have some burins or engravers. So these are all student illustrations, by the way. They really studied how the tools were made, and then the illustrations just turn out really beautiful. These are the types of things that people use when they're hunting, when they're gathering. Animals were definitely an important part of the story here, probably the big game, although things like mammoth would have been extinct by this time. So it's possible we're talking bison. I know there are examples of bison remains down in Wasilla. We're probably talking moose, maybe big hairy things with claws. Caribou for sure. Actually, the bones don't preserve very well at this site. We just have very small pieces. They're pretty difficult to identify. The other important thing, though, is that these artifact types, these microblades and microblade cores, they're pretty similar to the types of tools that we see just north of the Alaska Range in the Nenana and the Tanana valleys. And that really draws a connection across the state. And it's also, to me, suggesting that maybe the first folks to come into the Susitna Watershed were coming from the north and traveling south because they're using such similar tool types. It's also a tool type that was first recognized in Russia. So in the bigger picture, it also makes a connection across Bering Strait. which at that time would have been a land bridge and not filled in with water. The last time we went to Trapper Creek Overlook, we were finding some stone pieces that we thought could potentially be stone tools, and they were sitting just right on top of glacial gravels. And so one of the questions that we are still working on today is whether this triangular piece of stone and this kind of stone that looks like it may have been flint knapped along the edges, whether these represent stone tools or not. It's also possible that glacial processes made these particular ones. They do look a little distinct compared to the other tools that I showed you. So that's ongoing research, and it's possible that people were here even earlier if if the studies do show that these were made by people in the end. In terms of the raw materials, the stones that people are making their tools out of, there's a lot of these really nice quality cherts. Most of it's basalt, and there are a few pieces of obsidian or this really nice volcanic ash. The folks at UAF, and especially Jeff Rasick, did chemically characterize those for us, and volcanoes and volcanic deposits are geochemically distinct. So when you have a really good geological record of what those places are, you can sometimes figure out where on the landscape this tool stone came from. So Sumas Island, Wiki Peak, Batatena, these are three important obsidian sources that we know were used fairly early on. And in Trapper Creek, we know that some of the pieces were sourced to Batatena. So that's 420 kilometers to the northwest across multiple mountain ranges. That's a huge distance. We have another source that has an unknown location, and then a third source, which is also an unknown location, but there is another artifact at Healy Lake in the Tanana Valley, somewhere about over here, that was made on the same obsidian. So there's definitely connections being made across the state. So maybe despite lower population numbers initially, people are definitely still connected to each other across these really vast distances. We actually surveyed all of the drainages that we could up and down the middle Susitna, all the way up to Troublesome Creek, and really trying to figure out if there was a particular drainage that had more stone tools that would be better for flint knapping. And they all look pretty similar. It looks like a lot of the tools that we see are just being picked up out of the drainages where folks are. There's a lot of tool stone that's pretty good raw material. It might not be the highest quality for flint knapping, but certainly well beyond sufficient. But notice these are summer photos. In the winter, it's a lot more difficult to collect stone for flint knapping. And so one of the things that we think about the site is that because they're making microblades, those really tiny razor blades, that's a way that people, when they're flint knapping, can conserve a lot of stone. You can make a lot of tools out of a small piece, as opposed to one or two tools out of a cobble. So that might suggest winter activities. And that's an ongoing hypothesis that we're continuing to test around the state. And so far, I think it's a fine theoretical framework to work in, and we'll see what new sites come up. But certainly coming up with raw materials in the winter is going to be a challenge. So think about having to choose those materials in advance, storing them in a place that you can get back to and make your tools from. That's definitely part of decision making. But over time, there's some there's some important environmental changes that happen. So the forests that we're familiar with today, the boreal forest, the spruce and the birch, really fill in by this time between 7 and 5,000 years ago. And that changes the landscape where you could kind of see everything to full of trees. So that would have created a totally new experience and would have required a lot of re-landscape learning. It would have changed the animals that are there, forest animals as opposed to tundra animals. And we only know of one site that's actually occupied at that time, and it's Trapper Creek Overlook. And what we see there are these split cobble knives, these crescent-shaped bifaces, meaning it's a stone tool made on two sides, more engravers or birons, and scrapers, which are great for hide working especially. So still a stone-reliant technology, but these are probably geared especially for caribou. And so you can see how all of these artifacts are found scattered across the top of this landform. But the other thing is that this yellow layer, this haze tephra, so this is a volcanic eruption from Mount Hayes, the one that's sort of on the southwest side of the Alaska Range, not the Mount Hayes you can see from Fairbanks or Delta Junction area. And that left a marker regionally across south central Alaska. But whenever you have a big volcanic eruption, sometimes that disrupts animals and people's ability to live as they normally would. It contaminates water. And we've hypothesized that actually might have played a role in having people not be around the Susitna Valley for a little bit, because we are currently not familiar with any archaeological sites after that eruption until several thousand years later, basically 1,000 years ago. And I welcome any archaeologists out there who can fill in that time frame and find some archaeological sites that fit that gap. That would be great. But by 1,000 years ago, we see sites all over the area, and not just the middle Susitna, but across the watershed. So it seems like there's probably more people here. And what we've been finding over the years is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jim Carey's work on geolinguistics and Shempete's Alaska. It's a great resource. And we are finding that there's a really good association between finding ancient Dene sites near where those place names are. Sometimes they're not super pinpointed on the map, but often we're finding that there are known sites when you go to those places. And just in the last 3 or 4 years, I've based all of my surveys in the Talkeetna Mountains off of interviews with culture bearers and tribal citizens, and every place that they suggested that I go to had a long and ancient history. So there are some pretty close associations there we're finding. And the sites look a little bit different. We find these depressions in the landscape. We call them semi-subterranean. Sometimes we think they're caches or storage features, and sometimes we think they're houses. And what you're looking at here is a particularly deep one. It's represented by this one here. We think that this fits the ethnographic description of a deadfall to catch a large animal that might be trying to get into one of these caches that maybe it's storing salmon in particular. We also know about berry caches. All sorts of meat can be stored, and then you come back whenever you need food because you know where you stored your food, and that can carry you through winter. So we see a lot of these storage facilities all across the area. And for the most part, we think they're largely salmon. But nowadays we can do more geochemistry and sample those and try to pinpoint that more precisely. So here's some examples of features we think are houses, semi-subterranean houses. And when you excavate those, you can find this piece of wood is degrading pretty bad, but this would have been a building beam. You find all sorts of plant remains that we know are ethnographically important for Dene. In this case, we found some fish bones and also some bone beads that were even decorated. So you do find that material culture. And what that takes me to is just thinking about what this means in terms of remoteness, because it seems that people are using the landscape differently, they're living in it differently. Certainly there are trees now, but the trees are a fantastic resource, but also Dene understandings of the world mean that they're in relationships and interconnectedness with the trees and the animals. Certainly blazing trees, this is a more recent blaze, or tying a sapling into a knot would create trails and help make it easy to find your way in a landscape that's sometimes pretty difficult to find your way around. Case in point, there are a lot of bearing trees in the area, help folks figure out which way they're going when the weather takes a turn. So trails would have been certainly important. And we know that even though the Talkeetna area wasn't maybe the largest hub for Dene villages, it was a nexus point for many trails connecting different parts of Cook Inlet and Western Knik Arm, all the way up to Tangle Lakes, and also over to the Nenana Valley. So Talkeetna really was a gathering place for many generations, a place for folks to meet each other from across the state. And you can tell just by how far those stones are moving that maybe my or our conception of how far people moved is small, but we should really expand our sense of really just how far and capable Dene are and how far they did go. But the other thing is that no matter how high the vegetation is, that landscape learning process when you're starting from a new scenario, and maybe after coming back from a haze eruption, if the area was left to recover a little bit, that would have taken a little bit of learning and developing cognitive maps, the finding of a beaver dam that you can cross over, or figuring out which way is the best to cross a creek or a river. And you learn that information quickly, as you all know. And what we know from Jim Carey's work is that Dene place naming strategies are designed in a way for memorizing the landscape and understanding its structure. So naming those places while you're learning the landscape would have been really important for connecting trails and transforming maybe a specific place that's unfamiliar into one of familiarity. And so my last slide here is, I didn't show you a whole lot of artifacts from the last 1,000 years, and most of the oral history tells us in ethnographic records that those are often made out of materials that degrade really easily, or may have been protected from being found by later folks, but definitely trees, particularly birch and spruce, could provide you with building materials for structures, for watercraft and canoes. They provide medicine. Spruce tips are edible, so they're giving you food. You can create fish traps and other traps out of them. And so one thing that we can see that is completely consistent throughout all of this is how Dene life is designed for survival and adaptation to to those changing conditions as individuals and families and bands really got to know the place really intimately. Thank you. Let's see. I think I can see some of the Q&A, so I'll kind of have a look there, and if Melissa, if you see anything, don't hesitate to hop on. What are the characteristics of these sites that made them so desirable? Yeah, that's a great question. And I try to think about that a lot if the goal is to find a new site. Elevated sites seem to be really important, places that give you really great views. Places near fresh water, especially confluences of creeks and rivers, that's really important. You know, the current highway system is made on Dene trails as well, so those follow the rivers. But I definitely admit to having a pretty biased understanding of where the sites are because the area is so massive. I don't always get to systematically investigate a location the way I would want to, and I know there's a lot of information that's missing as well.
So the next question we have is when did people start using dog sleds for travel?
Ooh, that's a great question. So just to say up front, I don't 100%, no radiocarbon date pops out at me that's signaling the antiquity of that, but dogs were a really important part of life for Dene people, for Alaska Native people. And even though we don't have dog remains in some of the earliest sites that we know about so far, most of us, if not all of us, think that dogs were probably around with the first people in Alaska. So my guess is they were used pretty early on, and they're probably a lot older than the ethnographic examples or some archaeological examples that might be 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. I bet they're much older than that.
Interesting. In some of those photos that you had of the dig sites, there were blocks of sod in the middle. How are those digs designed? How do you decide how you're going to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in part, we started right at the top of the hill and also just kind of thinking about what's a great flat spot to have lunch. So that picture that with a nice view. It's a difficult process because we don't have X-ray vision and we can't really see what's under the surface. So in part, it's a lot of guesswork. But yeah, just thinking about a flat place where artifacts might not have gone downhill too much is a good starting point for me. And then initially when we started, this excavation plan looked much more like a checkerboard, and we were really just learning about the landform. And once we figured out where the most charcoal was or the most artifacts were, we realized year to year we could sort of focus on learning about those places in particular. And what's like, if you look at this map, there's this open area here. It's as if someone was sitting here working here, and then, you know, as you sit down in a picnic or at a campfire and you toss things to the front and back. And so it really gives you a personal sense of what's happening here, as if, you know, potentially someone was just sitting in this space and working and moving moving their materials around.
Wow.
But yeah, sometimes you excavate a unit and there's nothing there, but it's still really important because it helps us figure out that, hey, this is probably a sitting area, you know?
Yeah. That's wild to think about. And then the extrapolation of what you see to. There's a follow-up question for the dogs, and that is, where did the dogs come from?
Oh, great question. So the dogs probably would have been from Siberia. The earliest, there's a dog DNA group that's been doing a lot of this work from sort of Inupiat, Thule Arctic sites, and generally those all seem to have Siberian connections, not so much to outside or lower 48 necessarily. But the thing about dogs is that it's possible that there were multiple domestication events. That's still very much an open question. So I imagine the story is far more complex than we're telling right now.
The next question is, while moose hunting along the Little Susitna, I came across about 20 pits, 3 to 4 meters in diameter and 1 to 2 meters deep, mostly oriented along a moraine. They were spaced 10 to 20 meters apart, and they were similar to some of your slides. There were also dozens of smaller pits, about 1 meter across. Could these be house pits or caches? And if so, would the location of that area be of interest to you or others?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, based on that description, I wouldn't be surprised at all if these were caches and houses, potentially a village. Yeah, there are lots of moraines where these features do follow along the top of the moraine. And you know, they don't always have to be right next to fresh water. I've definitely walked you know, a good half mile to a mile away from, you know, Montana Creek or from the Big Sioux, and still finding caches way away from the nearest current water source. Yeah, and part of the thing about archaeology is, you know, having that regional perspective is really important. And also for Danae, while they know so much about their past, there's also this contact history, which was very disruptive for oral history. And so that really helps connect Danae to their oral histories, their family histories. And, you know, I think it's important for all of us, in a selfish way. You know, it really helps us figure out how we might be able to survive if things go awry, 100-mile-per-hour winds for an even longer period of time. And yeah, I wonder if I can put in the chat my email, and you can feel free to contact me if you want to talk about those places.
The distances from the water, is there, can you account for meander of water features too? Is there a way to determine kind of that old pathway?
Yeah, sometimes you can definitely see that. And now with GIS and mapping, it's if you have those skills, you can start to figure out, you know, you can start to model, and what is the likelihood that you would find a site here based on that kind of meander? Absolutely. But some of it just does not fall into that category. People were really everywhere.
Yeah. Sue asks, the big gap in people and activity is fascinating. The Talkeetna Museum has updated all of their exhibits, and she's asking if she could work with you in a future exhibit to help tell the story to visitors.
Oh, absolutely. And the Talkeetna Museum has been such a great resource for me as a student, and then bringing my students. So you've supported many generations of archaeology students and learning about Alaska. Thanks, Sue. And I would be more than happy to collaborate on future exhibits, and it would be great to bring in Danae. I'm thinking about Molly of Denali and how the stories are written by and Alaska Native people, and they get to choose how they're represented too, and that's just really great, and kind of being recognized all across the country and beyond. I hear about Molly of Denali all the time. Yeah, how many people were there? People estimations are really tough. I think in the 1910 census, they recorded 16 people living in Talkeetna. But I also know from interviews with different culture bearers that they know that their relatives weren't counted because they were actively trying to stay away. And when you have the boreal forest the way it is, it's pretty easy, if people are at fish camp or if they're hunting, it's pretty easy to not recognize how many people are living there. And they're also using the landscape in these much broader patterned circuits. So yeah, it's really tough to estimate people, but I bet it was more than 16 at 1910. We know that there were definitely thousands of people living around Knickarm, around Cook Inlet, and in different villages there, and those sites are really enormous. So I think I'm still comfortable saying population densities were much higher on the coast.
When you talk about the different types of stone being from different areas, does that hint towards trade or just broad human movements?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's really hard to tell, and probably both. I have had folks tell me that at the pace that I hike through the forest, that there's no way I would ever make it. I'm way too slow. I would need to cover much more ground. So I think on the one hand, we definitely shouldn't rule out that it wasn't individual movement, especially when we know from oral history just how far Dene land use and territories were. I think it's beyond plausible that it's a one person or a multi-person trek, but also despite lower population densities, they weren't that isolated. There were trails, they did connect with each other. So it may have been one, it may have been both. Let's see if I can, here's the stop share.
What's kind of the oddest thing you found?
The oddest thing that has ever been shared with me actually came from Jonathan Durr, and it was a whale bone. I don't remember the exact place that he found it, but it was somewhere in the middle Susitna. And so that's, again, is that trade? Is that someone going down to the coast? But I think whales used to come much further up the Susitna than they do today. But that was a big surprise.
Well, does anybody else have any questions here? Oh, there's another question that is it possible that there is oral history we don't know about yet?
Oh, absolutely. I'm fairly certain that Jim Carrey has a number of tapes that are not transcribed. I'm not sure how many there are, but it's something that that I think he's told me in the past. So we don't know what's on those tapes, and that would be a really great resource. But also, this summer I was in the Talkeetnas, and it was a community project. So I had culture bearers and tribal citizens in the field. We were working together. And we had chosen the location because other tribal citizens had told us, hey, we're really interested in learning about this place. I know my family has connections there. And as I looked through all of the reports and books and literature that I was familiar with, I didn't see that much information. But actually being on the landscape really transformed our experience. As we turned a corner and encountered a waterfall, all of a sudden, folks said, oh, wait, I actually know this waterfall. I remember a story that my dad told me. And so even though it wasn't in Shempe, it was definitely part of the oral tradition. And then when we came back to the road and started talking to other folks about it, we learned that, oh, this is a trail. It has a name. We definitely know about this waterfall. Yeah, so there's still quite a bit to learn. And when it's appropriate, done in that collaborative way, I think you get really great results, way better than if I'd have just gone out there myself and hiked.
Yeah, that's so cool that seeing the feature sparked a memory of someone else, of this story. That's fascinating. It's really cool.
And just as closing thoughts, as many of you know, the Mat-Su Borough is the most rapidly developing place in the state. And so there, folks are going to be encountering lots of new archaeological sites. And if you have any questions about that or the process, feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, there's definitely pretty significant overlap with oral history and finding sites, whether we know about them yet or not. I think there's a lot of sites out there that archaeological science doesn't know about, but that other folks in oral history do know.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been really nice to have folks that wouldn't get to be here in an in-person event. Makes kind of the COVID virtual thing. It's a perk to the virtual events. So thank you so much for joining us from the East Coast and sharing all of your knowledge and experiences in our watershed. We really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing your email for us to reach out to you as well.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to the audience and great questions. I really appreciate being able to share so much of what I've learned from many of you.
Well, thank you. And just to flag for folks moving forward, next month we will be having a discussion. The date is not set yet, about the Recreation Rivers Plan, the Susitna Basin Recreation Rivers Management Plan. We'll be having a speaker to chat with us about why it was created and its importance. And then in March, again, date to be determined, a scientist from UAF will be talking to us about lamprey in the watershed, and particularly the Susitna. So that'll be a really exciting event as well to learn about those creatures. So thank you again, Katie. It was great to have you here, and thanks everyone for joining us. And we will see you at our next event series.
Stay warm and cozy.
Will do. Bye, everyone.